saw it on the Discovery Channel. They got like this whole, cult built up around these tree toads. The skin's got these hallucinogenic properties. Let you see all these visions. It's really spiritual.
Yeah? I don't know.
It's supposed to take the doors of perception and swing them so wide open, you know? Plus, you get to see all these really cool streaks and trails and crap. Oh.
Well? Are you sure that's even a toad?
Welcome to Expanding Minds. I'm your host, Erik Davis, and this show explores the culture of consciousness. And when you're looking at the many domains of the mind and experience, and particularly when you're a modern person wrestling between often reductive accounts of our experience in terms of neurons and genetic programming and compounds and patterns of physiology on the one hand, and on the other hand, the sort of inherited wisdom traditions that are now pouring in on us from all directions throughout time and space, the kind of Alexandrian library of sacred and religious traditions, and the evident fact that religion and spiritual seeking does not go away. It's often hard to figure out exactly how to integrate these two. A lot of folks fall on one side or the other. I tend to believe that the action lies in the space in between, the liminal zone, the crisscrossed ways between body and spirit and mind and the mystery. And one of the sort of main routes or objects of interest in that middle zone are psychoactive substances. These visionary compounds and other transformative compounds have been with human beings for quite a long time, as far as we can tell, and probably back to time immemorial, as they say. I mean, we've discovered shamans with clearly powerful forms of cannabis buried with them as part of their mojo, strains of cannabis that were undoubtedly cultivated for their psychoactive properties rather than for their other uses. And the record on some psychedelic substances also goes very, very far back. There are snuff pipes from South America that were used to imbibe DMT, a substance we'll be talking about a little bit more later in this program, that are thousands of years old. So human beings and psychoactive substances go way back, and they continue to influence the modern world and the ways in which people think about consciousness and think about spirituality in the modern world. They've often been a vehicle for awakenings and for people to open up to a deeper or at least different sense of what the human mind and the human soul are capable of, and stirring all sorts of debates and, of course, controversies given the generally scheduled nature of these compounds. One of the most interesting things about thinking and talking about psychoactive substances is the way in which they themselves are a bridge between the scientific world of reductive materialism and scientific explanations and the worlds of the spirit, of dream, of vision, of synchronicity, of the deeper regions of mind, because it's quite evident from their functioning that they are material substances that affect material transformations of the body and the mind, working on the nervous system, working with the mystery of chemicals and neurotransmitters. And yet at the same time, they open up dimensions of profundity and bizarreness that few people can walk away from without being changed. And it's that tension that makes them in some ways particularly interesting as an aspect of the culture of consciousness. Today's guest is a perfect person to talk about these issues with. I first met Dennis McKenna through his brother Terence McKenna, who was the celebrated sort of mushroom bard of the 1990s, a fascinating man that I was very blessed to get to know, a real inspiration for me, not just in terms of the things he talked about, but the way he talked about him and his ability to be a smart, funny, incredibly eloquent guy working in the margins of psychedelic consciousness and talking to young people and people from all sorts of aspects of the world rather than being stuck in some ivory tower. And Terence's adventures with his brother go way back into the, well, since they were kids, they go back to the beginning, but even in terms of the psychedelic explorations back to the early 70s, at least, and they wrote a book together, The Invisible Landscape, a fascinating, dense, and marvelous text, which you probably can still find online. Anyway, and I got to get to know Dennis a bit after that, and Dennis, in addition to being an explorer and a thinker about these realms, is also a botanist, an ethnobotanist, and a man of great, strong scientific temperament. And so he really crosses that line as well in his own work, in his writings and his studies and various teaching gigs. So I'm very happy to have Dennis on, but before that I'd just like to introduce my co-host, Maja Daou, Expanding Minds esoteric librarian. How you doing, Maja?
Good, Erik. How are you?
So what about this topic of ayahuasca? That's the visionary substance that we're going to be talking about the most, the South American brew containing DMT and harmaline-like substances, MAOI inhibitor. What does this stir for you?
Well, for me, when I think about these things, one of my favorite words that's used for, ayahuasca and beta-carbolines and MAO inhibitors was one that was made in 1979, and it's the word entheogen. And a lot of people have heard that word, but to me, the meaning of it is so descriptive of these substances. It literally means to create or generate God within. And to me, that says so much because these substances have that alchemical effect of releasing the spirit from matter. And it's like you were mentioning earlier how, it's that liminal space where spirit and matter meet. And there's something about these chemical constituents that have that ability to really potentiate that expression. They really have a physical manifestation of that alchemical pursuit to release the spiritual from matter through a chemical, reaction. It's pretty amazing, and that's one of my favorite things when thinking about these things, that it is and has been found to have these mystical effects on the physical body through a very chemical way.
Yeah, we'll be bringing Dennis on in just a second, but I wanted to say one thing about ayahuasca in particular when we're talking about entheogen or talking about the religious or spiritual dimensions of psychedelics. In some contexts they have them, in some contexts they don't. In some ways, there is pretty clear evidence that psychoactive mushrooms, the magic mushroom we're familiar with, are actually rather extensively found throughout the world, but that in most cultures we have no real evidence that they were used.
That's
Some people like to speculate that they've been used as part of experiences through time immemorial, but in a lot of places it's pretty clear that while those substances were around, they didn't actually become incorporated into the spiritual pharmacology. And yet in other situations, they clearly have these incredibly deep healing and even kind of cosmic dimensions. And one of the most interesting things about ayahuasca today is the way in which, even as it spreads into the developed world, into Anglo-American world is the one that I know the best, but it's also quite popular throughout Europe. There, people go down to Peru. There are underground networks of people taking these substances. But even as ayahuasca spreads through the developed world, it has retained its religious form.
Yes, exactly.
It's still, it's almost entirely taken in a sacred context of religious intention, unlike almost every other psychoactive drug which you can name, which while it may have a history or prehistory of sacred use, once it meets the hungry, ravenous ghost world of the West, becomes sort of a weird, party drug or novelty or just intensifier. So there's something very special about ayahuasca.
Yes.
So Dennis, how are you doing?
I'm doing well, Erik. Good to be here.
Thank you so much for being on the show.
It's a pleasure to be here.
So I'm wondering, what are you working on now? Are you doing scientific work? Are you teaching? I know you've worn many hats over your career, and I'm curious what one you're wearing now.
Well, it's true. I wear a number of hats. Well, right now I'm in the academic mode. I've been teaching a course in ethnobotany and ethnopharmacology in Ecuador over the summer for Arizona State Field Studies program. I was teaching with Kat Harrison, who, as you know, is Terrence's ex-wife, so I guess she's still my sister-in-law. But we teach together. Together we've been teaching courses for the University of Minnesota in Hawaii every January called Plants and Human Affairs. And this summer gig, if you want to call it that, was kind of a version of that, but we transplanted it to the Ecuadorian Amazon. So that's what I've been doing with my summer, just trying to stay employed. And then in the fall, I'm teaching several courses here at the University of Minnesota, one in ethnopharmacology, one on botanical medicines, and a new course in the College of Liberal Arts, which I haven't taught before, but it should be fun. It's called Cross-Cultural Perspectives on Drugs. So that's what I'm doing these days.
Excellent. Now, when you were a young man, did your interest in ethnobotany or botany or the science of pharmacology and biology, did that emerge from an earlier interest in visionary plants and experiences, or was it vice versa?
No, I'd have to say my interest came out of our early experiences, many of which my brother and I shared. A fascination, really, with altered states, and especially the psychedelic DMT. We were children of the 60s, I guess you could say, and my brother was in school at Berkeley at that time, and I was still in high school, but I visited him over the summers. And you didn't encounter DMT very much. It was kind of rare, but we did encounter it in a synthetic form, and we were fascinated by it. We thought that DMT in some ways was the quintessential entheogen or psychedelic, and we determined to follow up on that. And we didn't really know how to do that, but I think when we discovered shamanism, and initially I guess that was through Carlos Castaneda's first book, The Teachings of Don Juan, and then we understood that there is a whole tradition of using these visionary plants in the shamanic context, and so that gave us a lead, a direction in which to explore it. And then shortly after that, we discovered the work of Ari Schultes, the famous Harvard ethnobotanist who spent years in the Amazon collecting plants, but also exploring and discovering all of these many psychoactive plants that are used in South America. And he's, deservedly known as probably the world's expert on hallucinogenic plants. I mean, unfortunately, he left this realm in, I think, 1998 or somewhere around there. But really, it was his writings that inspired us initially to go to South America, and you know, he's been a hero figure, a very admired mentor for many people in the area of ethnopharmacology, and it's really, you know, in some ways it's because of Schultes that I keep going back to South America. I just can't stay away from it. And so, you know, that led us into, you know, kind of the path that we got on, that we talked about in The Invisible Landscape, and my brother's book, True Hallucinations, which is a much more sort of accessible narrative of what led us to go down there in 1971 and get into a whole lot of things that we really had no idea what we were getting into. But that was it. That's what got it started. And then, you know, when I came back from that experience, I realized that I had to learn a lot more science. I had to learn neuroscience and botany and pharmacology, and that's sort of what got me on the path to becoming scientific about.
Dennis, can I ask you, did you find it was frustrating in your scientific pursuits trying to talk to other scientists about this stuff? I mean, were you well received? I know you still teach in, you know, academic, you know, context. So have you found that it's just a battle trying to deal with some of these people? Because I did biochemistry as well, and I found that, you know, even trying to talk about that kind of stuff to most scientists, they get really bummed out. So I was just wondering if you had positive experiences with that, or if they were negative.
Well, yeah, it's kind of a tough road to hoe. In some ways, it is, but you know, I mean, what you find is that even in the academic context, you know, there are a lot of pretty open-minded people, and if you and you find that you can connect with them. I mean, they may not be very upfront about their interests, but they are there. And I guess what makes me different is, you know, I don't know when to shut up. I mean, I'm not the kind of person to sit down and stop making noise, you know. Mm-hmm. And this has fascinated me all of my life. And I've gotten some breaks, you know. I've been able to continue in this work. I mean, maybe if I'd gone a more conventional academic route, I'd be a, you know, distinguished professor somewhere instead of simply a assistant professor in a marginal department. But the point is that, you know, you do find the opportunities to work on these things. And you know, in the field of neuroscience, for example, I think, you know, although they're reluctant to talk about it, if you can make personal connections with many people in that field, you know, you find that very often what motivated them initially to go into the field was a desire to, you know, investigate these kinds of things, to look into the neuroscience of altered states, whether through psychedelics or other technologies, you know. And then people become faced with the realities of they have to stay employed, they have to get grants, they have to do all these things. And so, you know, it is politically incorrect. But in some ways, I think not to acknowledge your interest is intellectually dishonest. And so I've tried to remain honest to my sort of original mission.
Yeah, I think it's your career is an example of that. I've been thinking a lot about integrity lately, and how integrity kind of keeps its own momentum going. Like, there are so many rational reasons for you, I'm sure, over many years, for you to pull back on your interests and your background for the sake of, you know, less anxiety for your family, for your gig, whatever it is. And yet it seems like by staying kind of true and honest in that deeply scientific, in an ethical sense, way, about just being clear and honest about what's going on before you, it seems like you've developed a certain, you know, momentum or a coherence about your work that really comes through your teaching and your talking. You know, a few weeks ago we had Mike Jay on, a British historian of science and of drugs, and his new book, The Atmosphere of Heaven, is about the origins of the Pneumatic Institute and the discovery of nitrous oxide.
I've heard
one
of
one of the things he talks about in that book that's so fascinating that we talked about a little bit on air was the fact that in those days, if you were a scientist exploring compounds, poisons, anything that affected the mind, it was completely routine to take it on yourself. And Humphrey Davy, who's like one of the great scientists of British history of the early 19th century, who was one of these people who first explored the psychoactive properties of nitrous oxide, in fact became quite a fan of it, was legendary for taking audacious risks in terms of self-experimentation. So self-experimentation was once part of the nobility of the scientist. And then at some point in the 20th century, it gets split so much so that it's almost forbidden to mention subjective experience or personal experience, that there has to be this rigorous divide between the two. And it's really unfortunate. It does seem like that there's some integration happening these days, at least a little sense of return. Do you have a sense that there's a way in which that paradigm of the total split between objective and subjective is breaking down a bit?
Well, yes, I think so. I think it's a slow process, but I think what you say about self-experimentation is quite right. I mean, back in the day when Humphrey Davies and William James and people like this were exploring all this, not only was it accepted to self-experiment, it was expected that that's what you do. That's, the mission was to investigate these altered states, and it was not ethical not to experience them yourself. I think in the modern era, a person that exemplifies that very much is the chemist Alexander Shulgin, who many of your listeners may know about. He was a pharmacologist and a chemist working for Dow Chemical back in the 50s, and he got interested in what pharmacologists call structure-activity relationships, which are the relationships between the structure of a molecule, a drug, and its activity, its pharmacological activity. Well, he had a profound experience with peyote early in his career, and so he got very interested in mescaline and decided to do structure-activity work with mescaline, and went on to make over 300 different mescaline analogs, all of which he tested on himself, in a very serious, careful way, along with he had a trusted group of human guinea pigs, basically friends of his, who were, psychotherapists, doctors, pharmacologists, pretty serious people, and they all carefully evaluated, his compounds. They kept careful notes, and they produced a tremendous body of knowledge, about these things, about structure-activity relationships of these psychedelics. But Sasha Shulgin, everyone calls him Sasha, he paid a price for his intellectual honesty. He didn't keep his job at Dow Chemical. He became an independent consultant, and he was able to continue his work legally. He had permission from the DEA to, continue his work as a research scientist, but he never sort of achieved the academic cachet that he might have if he backed off from that. But he continued to work, and in my opinion, the man should have been given the Nobel Prize. I mean, he has contributed more to an understanding of what you might call the brain-mind relationship, really, than anyone else of his day, and yet he's been sort of, in some ways stigmatized as some kind of, wild-eyed, irresponsible person, and that's just not the case. So I guess Sasha and I are on the same wavelength, although, I don't aspire to come to his level of accomplishment. But that's an example. And that sort of relates to this whole issue about, what is science really supposed to be about? I mean, in its purest form, science is supposed to be about exploring the unknown. It's about discovering new knowledge, and in its sort of idealistic embodiment, it's the search for truth. And I think that these aspects of science fade into the background because we live in an era of big science, and science is an expensive proposition. It's funded largely through government subsidies, and so that really puts a lot of restraint on a lot of constraints on what people can do in the context of big science, and I think a lot of scientists lose sight of this fact. What is science about? The search for truth? No, it's about publishing papers and having graduate students and getting grants and playing the whole game. And, the search to uncover knowledge somehow, it gets overlooked in all this activity. So that's unfortunate.
Yeah, the ironies that surround this issue of big science or institutional science grow even greater when you start talking about psychoactives, because, of course, while we can say psychoactives and think of scheduled substances, popular scheduled substances like cannabis or LSD or cocaine, that, of course, psychoactive substances are also an enormous industry, and there's this exploding, metastasizing world of prescription pharmaceutical psychoactives that are, being sort of like this large-scale experimental project on the global population.
Right.
So that a lot of the same issues about subjectivity, the relationship of agency to drugs, the relationship of identity and experience to different neurological systems or neurotransmitters. Like, all of these things are very much in the air. They're very much big business. So that the contradictions of our relationship to psychoactives, and also within science, between this sort of deeper truth and surface truth, become even greater when you look at these substances. I mean, how do you? I mean, from where you stand, and with your you're very planted in biological pharmacology and ethnopharmacology as opposed to synthetic production of psychoactives. But how does that whole world look like to you as a scientist and as someone who's
I think it leads to a certain cognitive dissonance, and it certainly leads to a mixed message, when you're trying to speak to young people, for example, about drugs and about their relationship to drugs. Because, on the one hand, you have this whole sort of, as you say, the psychopharmaceutical industry, and this notion that, we can engineer personality, essentially, and it's perfectly okay to give young people all these drugs for ADHD and for depression, and now the atypical antipsychotics are becoming quite popular, and basically these are Band-Aid, solutions for deep, I think, crises of the spirit. And yet, on the other hand, you've got the shamanic plants, the psychedelic plants, or entheogenic plants, if you prefer, and the tradition of shamanism, which is practiced in other parts of the world. It's practiced in most of the world, but it's utterly forbidden in this country, and it's become an underground thing. And yet, I think that, especially the young people I speak with, there's a sense that, this is essentially a hypocritical situation. Many of the students that I teach seem to have been on one or other psychopharmaceutical at some time during their career. It's quite common. I would at a guess, I'd say probably 40% of the students in my classes, have been treated with one or more psychopharmaceuticals during the course of their high school and early college careers. And so then there is that expectation that this is perfectly all right. Many of them confided in me, yeah, of course I smoke pot. It has less side effects than the drugs, they want to prescribe me, and that kind of thing. So there is an element, I think, in this use of these so-called, prohibited drugs, or these drugs that are not accepted. There's a certain effort going on to essentially self-medicate, or to find some kind of a spiritual reward that the current sort of biomedical approach to personality, what I call chemical personality engineering, is not providing.
Yeah, I often think about the Western psychopharmacology as kind of like lame shamanism. Whereas we tend to hear that like shamans are like bad doctors, or from a traditional Western perspective, it's like they're acting like doctors, but they don't really know what they're doing. It's almost the reverse when you start dealing with issues of mind and body, where it's like on some level it's all shamanism. It's just that they do it very poorly and it's very expensive.
Well,
I want to
I would agree with you that it's lame. I don't agree with you that it's shamanism. In fact, this is the problem. They've taken exactly that element out of it, and the notion most doctors who prescribe these things are not even psychiatrists. They're not even that qualified to provide any kind of, other support. And,
the way in which I think it is like shamanism is that it's a cultural narrative about efficacy. If you grow up in a culture where the shaman is the guy who's got the power, and I'm not talking about specifically ayahuasca shamanism, but just that there's a sort of traditional healer and they have the power, and that part of their efficacy is the fact that that's the story that we believe. I mean, there is a way in which there are elements of, I'm not saying that shamanic pharmacology is all placebo effect, but there's an element of kind of performativity and sort of agreement that lays the groundwork for real healing in traditional situations. And I think that in many ways, when you look at the statistics on SSRIs, for example, that they're actually not very efficacious, but they're just enough over the line to make them be passed off as being powerful, and they're not even that powerful. And a lot of what people are actually doing is just, it's their own decisions, it's their own will, it's the theater of the drug or the pill, the idea that the pill has an answer, that is producing a lot of some of the effect. And so that's the way in which I mean that it's another theater of medical healing, but it does it in a really poor way.
And much of the efficacy, to the degree that there is efficacy with these things, it comes from the placebo effect. And I think that what shamans, I mean, if ever psychedelics are going to be used in a therapeutic context, in a biomedical context, and, there are now signs that that's beginning to come back. But what therapists have to understand is you cannot separate the pharmacology from the context. I mean, we knew this from the earliest days of Leary and Metzner and these people. Set and setting is everything, and what the shamans do is they create a context to allow these experiences to unfold in a safe environment, and an environment where the shamans know what the person is going through. They're usually going through it with them, and they can provide some modulation of the experience in order to guide the person through it by using, Icaro's magical songs, music, different kinds of cleansing. In other words, they set up an environment it's not exactly psychotherapeutic, but the effect of it is the same. It provides a context in which the person can let this stuff come out, let it unfold, and then integrate it. That's what's lacking in psychopharmacology. It's not about letting things unfold. It's about it's about repressing it. It's about damping it down and essentially putting a Band-Aid over all of these unconscious processes. So yes, the person appears normal and can function, but in some sense, none of the problems that led them to that state in the first place are really addressed by these psychopharmaceuticals.
Well, that's a great segue. I want to talk a little bit more about ayahuasca. Before I do that, I want to let people know that you can call in and ask a question of Dennis at 888-873-4643. It's a toll-free call, and you can also email your questions to mind@techgnosis.com, TECHGNOSIS. That's also my website, www.techgnosis.com. And before we go back to Dennis, I just want to play a recording of a shaman in Colombia that was recorded in 1976. It's from a really excellent, a fairly obscure CD called Yague Pinta. And these are psychedelic shaman songs of Santiago Mutamba Joy. So this is the real deal. This was just recorded on a cheap tape deck in an ayahuasca ritual setting, and I just want to play a little bit of this track.
No, estamos ligeros. Santiago Mutamba Joy, and the CD is called Yague Pinta. It's on the Locust label. It's fascinating because it's totally raw. And even one of the things I like about it is it's not really music, at least the way that we normally think of music. I mean, they're clearly songs, but the way they're sung, the vibration, the nasal quality, the repetition, the way they start and stop, and you hear some noise and a few sounds, and it's a really remarkable performance that keys us into one of the most powerful dimensions of the traditional ayahuasca ceremony, which is the way that music and sound organize the experience. Dennis, I know you have had a lot of experience in ayahuasca circles. Can you talk a little bit about the way that the Icaros function, even from a more neurological perspective as well as a ritual one?
Sure. Well, actually, what he's singing and what's known in mestizo, in Amazonian shamanism, these magic songs are called Icaros, Icaros, and while he was singing, I was just looking at iTunes here to see what they have. They actually have quite a list of Icaros, so your readers might check it out if they're interested in more of that. I'm not really here to plug anybody's Icaros, but there's quite a few of them out there. But the Icaros are one way, as you say, to modulate this setting, this sensory, oral, environment. And it has a lot to do, I think, with synesthesia, which is one of the things that psychedelics facilitate, the translation of one sensory modality into another. And, for example, you see music or, you hear colors, this kind of thing. And this is a common experience on psychedelics, and most people don't experience it any other way. So the shaman can use the Icaros in some ways to modulate and guide what the person is seeing. They can actually, influence their vision. And within the context of ayahuasca ceremonies, it's not uncommon for everyone to be having a similar experience. I don't know if you want to call it telepathy exactly, but it's something.
Well, telepathy is good because they used to call some of those substances telepathines, right?
Indeed.
Yeah.
When harmine was first isolated from Banisteriopsis back in the 30s, it was called telepathine.
Yeah.
And then only later was it called harmine because they found that it was identical to an alkaloid that had already been discovered in Paganum harmala, which is a shrub that's native to the Mideast, and which may have also been used either as an MAO inhibitor in some Middle Eastern preparations, such or whatever. But harmine, because it was discovered earlier, it was named after Paganum harmala, and then they found that telepathine compound, and so then the earlier name took precedence. But yeah, there was.
Did you ever have like telepathic experiences that you experienced with other people at the same time?
Have I?
Mm-hmm.
Yes. Yes, absolutely. Both on ayahuasca and mushrooms. It's not really that uncommon.
Well, and one other thing, actually, I was been dying to ask you about, Dennis, along those lines, is one of those shared experiences on these substances regarding the self-transforming machine elves. And I wanted to ask you if you had any particular experiences with these guys. They're like these kind of, anthropomorphic creatures that many people experience when they go into these states. And I personally have experienced them also. I was dismembered by them in an experience that I had, and that's very common. Mircea Eliade talks about that. And I know in your and Terence's book, The Invisible Landscape, you guys mention it, but I was just curious if you had any, particularly mind-blowing experiences with the self-transforming machine elves, and I also just like to say that name a lot.
Yeah, well, the experience you had of being dismembered and put back together, I mean, that's classical shamanism. That goes on. That's part of shamanic initiation virtually in every shamanic tradition that's practiced the world over, and whether or not facilitated with psychoactives. But the self-transforming machine elves, I mean, yeah, it's a great phrase. I don't, to be honest, and I don't get self-transforming machine elves, or at least I wouldn't call them that. But I definitely get a sense of entities, or, there's another intelligence over there, wherever over there is, on the other side of this membrane, in this parallel reality. And you could call them, jeweled basketballs or intelligent self-transforming machine elves or something, but they definitely have a sense, one has a sense that they are separate from you, and they're not, I mean, common sense tells you that they have to be some other part of your brain that's presenting itself as different than yourself, but who really knows? But they do have this sort of, on the DMT experience, they do have this sort of, almost comical aspect to them. They're very excited. They're very enthusiastic. They want you to pay attention to what they're showing you. With ayahuasca, you don't get that so much. Ayahuasca is DMT, but ayahuasca is DMT because of its pharmacokinetics, it's instead of being compressed into 10 minutes or so, it's stretched out over 4 hours or so. So it presents itself in a different kind of way. But the sense of an other, the sense of connection with entities that the ayahuasqueros might call spirits, and you certainly have that sense, is something that's very common in these tryptamine states. Psilocybin is a tryptamine, ayahuasca, and DMT all sort of share the same, if you want to say, phenomenology, or they're different ways to access a similar dimension that you might call the tryptamine dimension. And actually, there's a very interesting book that's been out maybe a year that some of your readers or listeners might be interested in. It's called Inner Paths to Outer Space. And it's an anthology edited by Rick Strassman, who is the MD that was the first person to achieve FDA approval to do a clinical study with DMT back in the early 90s. And his work, his earlier book was called DMT, the Spirit Molecule, which is actually also very interesting. But this later book kind of addresses the issue of, is there a reality out there? Is this just an aspect of the self, or is there really another dimension?
Well, that relates back actually to something we had talked about a few shows back, Erik, on the I Ching show about coming into contact with something outside of yourself. And I just think it's kind of interesting, and I'll just say this as a little bit woo-woo, because there are actually 64 beta-carbolines that we have discovered so far. There's also 64 hexagrams in the I Ching, and of course 64 base pairs in DNA. So I just think that's kind of interesting when you're considering if there's some kind of, is it outside, is it inside, is it the same thing?
64 beta-carbolines, you say? Oh, that's a new one. I hadn't heard that.
Very interesting. I wanted to ask you also, when you're either in the throes of experience or contemplating some of these more outside questions about the nature of entities, the nature of consciousness, how does consciousness fit in the cosmos, is there a certain point where you feel your kind of more traditional scientific training and questioning sort of drops off? Or do you feel like you're actually able to go into the heart of these experiences and these questions with a somewhat different angle or strategy than people who are not really that who don't really know science, who are not practitioners, who don't really understand that kind of thinking or that kind of approach?
Well, that's a good question. No, I think you walk a fine line. I think that I think that the scientific sort of stance and kind of a healthy skepticism and an emphasis on empiricism, what is it you're experiencing, is a good stance to take. But initially it helps keep you grounded, but I think also it's very important to recognize the limitations of science. And these psychedelics, for me, if they do nothing else, they're a constant reminder of how little we know. And science tends to arrogate to itself the idea that, we pretty well understand how the world is made up. There's a little mopping up left to be done, but basically we've got it figured out. No, we don't have any of it figured out. We have such a tiny slice of reality figured out that we need to cultivate humility, and we need to remember how little we know, really. Science is inherently limited because science works on what you can physically measure. And science is very good at taking very tiny pieces of reality, very tiny slices of reality, and dissecting them in detail and describing them in detail. But when it comes to the big picture, how does all this fit together? Science is not so good. I mean, there is no overarching scientific paradigm that explains, the very odd situation that we find ourselves in the universe. Just the fact that we're minded entities with a subjective world that, mind is real. We know it's real because we live inside minds. We are minds. And this is why science is so uncomfortable in some way, I think, when it comes to trying to develop paradigms that explain consciousness. They wish it was all neurochemistry. They wish it could all be explained in terms of brain electrical activity and this kind of thing. But I don't think it can be. And I think, any scientific paradigm that purports to explain consciousness that doesn't take account of these realms of experience is doomed to be incomplete. And this is why, the conversation gets a little uncomfortable when you confront neuroscientists with this. What about this, doctor? How does this fit into your reductionist paradigm? And the fact is it doesn't, because I think, I just think our understanding is very limited in some ways.
Great. That's an excellent answer. Hey, we have a caller from Arizona, Oliver.
Oliver.
Hello?
Hello.
Hi. I have a question for Dennis. I've read True Hallucinations, and I was just wondering if you could say anything about the relationship between the Icaros and your experiments with hypercarbylation.
Well, yes and no, because given limited time, I mean, we've almost eaten up the whole hour here. I'm not going to go into hypercarbylation in any detail, but this idea that, we could use sound to actually affect chemical reactions or affect physiological transformations on the molecular level is not so far from the notions, from the ways that Icaros and these sorts of things might be used in traditional ayahuasca healing. I mean, much of ayahuasca usage shamanically is about healing, and the shaman, the ayahuasquero, has various tools that he can use, and one of them is sound. I mean, there are songs that can be used for healing. There are stones that can be used for healing. There are, these magical things called virotes, which are conceived as little darts that can be sort of psychically transferred into a person to cause harm to them, but also to counteract these malevolent forces. So this is all sort of grades over into the area of, psychic healing. I mean, much of what the shaman does in this altered states is to look inside the person, and using a kind of psychic X-ray in some ways, they can tell where the problems are, and what to do to fix them. And it's not exactly it's not a diagnostic procedure like a doctor might carry out, because the understanding is that almost all illness comes from magical forces. Even if it's a physical illness, it's because somebody put the whammy on you. And so you have to address it on that level, and then the physical illness will resolve. Now,
Dennis, we have another question, although we don't have that much time, and it's a big
sure.
one. This is an email question from Jay at Arthur Magazine, and he was just wondering about how you feel about Terence's 2012 theories. Just in a nutshell, he came up with this idea of the time wave that posited a kind of great end of the cycle at this date into December of 2012, and sort of linked it with the I Ching. And it was it's a very esoteric, kind of prophetic idea. But these days, of course, it's gained a lot of currency. The 2012 idea is very popular. How do you feel about it now, from where you sit?
Well, it's hard to answer that question in a short time. But basically, my take on 2012 at least on Terence's time wave theory, is I've always been very skeptical about the time wave theory, and basically because it's not a theory. It can't be disproven, and a theory, to be a good theory, you have to articulate what will disprove it, and Terence never really did that. But now, of course, 2012 has emerged as a cultural meme because of the whole Mayan calendar thing. And when it comes to 2012, I tend to retreat back into my scientific stance and say, well, nobody really knows, but let's wait and see. I guess we're close enough that all we have to do is sort of keep our skeptical powder dry and just say, well, we'll see. But we should also remember that, no prophecy has ever come true. So based on that, I'm not canceling my appointments for 2013. And I'm just sort of, and in some sense, I think that the whole 2012 expectation, particularly to the degree that it's linked to a particular day, is unhealthy. It's a way of shirking our responsibility, hell, we may not make it to 2012 the way things are going. So we can't afford to sit around and wait for 2012, and after that it'll all be good. We need to get to work right now to save our butts, if I can use that term. You know what I'm saying? The space aliens are not coming to save us. Jesus is not coming to save us. The only people that are going to save us is ourselves. We've got to get ourselves out of this mess we're in, and I think that all of this focus on 2012 is in some way just another way to shirk our responsibility and not face up to, what we're faced with. And
well, how do you see ayahuasca playing into this issue of the urgency of our situation?
Well, I think that ayahuasca, I think what's happening with ayahuasca and the way that it is sort of in a way it's emerging out of the Amazon and it's going global. And some people have decried this, but I actually think it's a very hopeful thing, and I think it's essentially a further unfolding of this evolutionary, co-evolutionary relationship that we have with these plants. I think that, and ayahuasca in some way is now leading the charge, but we've had these relationships with these plants. The problem is that on an evolutionary time scale, these things unfold, over millennia, over sometimes millions of years. Now, with the acceleration in the global crisis and the impending planetary disaster, in some ways, if these psychedelics are in some ways, the biosphere or Gaia or however you want to formulate it, trying to get us to wake up, then that's all to the good. I don't know if I wrote an essay a few years ago called Ayahuasca and Human Destiny that kind of addresses some of this. Is
that online, Dennis?
It is somewhere. I can send it to you, and you're welcome to post it.
And there's always Google. Well,
and there's always Google, right? It's there somewhere. I haven't posted it, but I'd be happy to have you put it on your site if you'd like.
Well, Dennis McKenna, thanks so much for joining us here on Expanding Mind. You've expanded my mind.
It seems like we've barely touched the surface of it here.
No.
Yeah, it's amazing how quickly an hour goes. It's when you're having a good conversation. Thanks, Maja. I wanted to announce next week we'll be having Jeff Warren, who's a remarkable Canadian science writer who wrote a marvelous book about the mind and consciousness called The Head Trip, and he's a very energetic, very entertaining fellow. I'm sure we'll have a great chat. And once again, you've been listening to Expanding Mind on the Progressive Radio Network. Any last words, Maja?
I think I hate having last words because that means I can't talk anymore, but I want to say have a good time.
All right. Thanks again.
Okay, Erik and Maja, great to talk with you. Maybe we can circle back sometime and revisit some of this stuff.
Absolutely.
Okay.
Okay.
Good afternoon.
For the first time, I feel time like a heartbeat. The seconds pumping in my breast like a reckoning. The numinous mysteries that once seemed so distant and unreal, threatening clarity in the presence of a truth entertained not in youth, but only in its passage. I feel these words as if their meaning were weight being lifted from me, knowing that you will read them and share my burden as I have come to trust no other. That you should know my heart, look into it, finding there the memory and experience that belong to you, that are you, is a comfort to me now as I feel the tethers loose and the prospects darken for the continuance of a journey that began not so long ago, and which began again with a faith shaken and strengthened by your convictions, if not for which I might never have been so strong now, as I cross to face you and look at you incomplete, hoping that you will forgive me for not making the rest of the journey with you.